All right, we will go the way here two more laws, and I think we're going to do that one here. So we're going to move through here. I actually have some other presentations I did with Kristen Light. I actually did the two laws, and then I did a second presentation on applications. So I'll give you an overview of both of them. So we'll move through this. In your booklet, I do have a skeleton outline for this, and you can find that on page 17, and then I'll get on page 19 and 20 some also. So, page 17, the language of the lesson. So there are two laws that we're looking at here. These the teacher and the learner are the two people involved. The two major tools. The carpenter has his tools, the mechanic has his tools, the teacher has two major tools. The one is language, words, terms, words. And the law says that the teaching language must be common to teacher and learner. That seems to be so obvious that it shouldn't even need to be said. But as we'll see, it really is the heart of a lot of teaching. So, in my words, be sure your pupils understand what you are saying. It goes without saying that if the students can only understand Spanish, it would be foolish to try to teach them in English. But we'll see how this works. And then the second law, the law of the lesson, we'll just look at the law now, but we'll unpack a bit later. And on your paper, the law number 4 is that the truth to be taught must be learned through truth already known, which means that you're going to somehow connect explanations of the new lesson to what your pupils already know, so they can build on it. It's fascinating. My nephew, my brother-in-law said one time when his son was maybe only about 4 or 5 years old, he asked one of his why questions. He explained something to him, and his son said, but what do I hang that onto? And it was, in the child's words, it captured exactly the problem of being given some knowledge or some explanation that totally unconnected to anything else in your life. And if I told you that the Prime Minister of India's knee has been replaced, well, so what? What do you do with that? What does that have anything to do with trying to stuff? All right, let's move ahead here. So, law number 3, looking at the top. I have these, let's begin with this. So, somebody read the definition of a vector for us. Go ahead, Justin. You're Justin.
I am Justin, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Vector is a quantity that has magnitude and direction, commonly represented by a directed line segment whose length represents magnitude, orientation represents direction.
All right. Is that English? Is that English? Okay, so now you know what a vector is, right? Now, typically, when people look at that, I see some smiles and some chuckles. Why? Is that funny? Why do you kind of have the knowing smile? What about this? Is there a problem?
There's quite a few words that we don't use in daily life. Thinking about it long enough, you could get the meaning, but it's not, for some people maybe more words, for some people less, but it's not words we use in our everyday speech.
Correct. And so the key point we'll soon see here, but this is to identify the problem. We probably all know what a quantity is. We probably know what magnitude is, magnitude, like an earthquake, magnitude. We probably know what direction it is. In some context, north, south, east, and west. Commonly, line segment, directed line segment, we probably have some idea that might be a little fuzzy. Length, magnitude, orientation. But, so here's where we go back to be sure your people understand what you're saying. This has nothing to do with English and English. You can have English-speaking people talking to English-speaking people. But the law of the language says that the language must be common to teacher and learner. Because from now on, if I use the word vector, if I went to vector, and if you have no idea what I'm talking about, we're not communicating. The Apostle Paul would maybe call that speaking in tongues. How shall the person who speaks in an unknown tongue, how shall the hearers know if nobody interprets? And as we'll soon see, a major task of teaching involves teaching terms. So, getting to your little circles here, the Venn diagram. So, the medium is that it's the territory the teacher and students are in this center together, and we use words we both understand. So whatever the subject is, if we say some, product, or capital, states and capitals, as long as we all understand what these terms mean, we can talk and we can go somewhere. But if all of a sudden, here's a teacher, I understand something that you don't. Over here is B doesn't understand something. We don't communicate. If I all of a sudden throw out a term that you don't understand, why we're not communicating. And every subject involves the use of terms. We'll look at that very quickly here. Now, also related to this is not only are there particular words, but what complicates it is that many words have multiple meanings. And so, back with the vector, so orientation or magnitude, the student has limited understanding, and so we have to understand what a particular word means in a particular context. An example from Scripture would be where Jesus told his disciples one time that Lazarus is asleep. You remember what their response was? No, if he's sleeping, he's doing what? They were thinking of sleeping. And Jesus was thinking of sleeping too, but he had a different definition in mind. He said, and then the scripture writer says, they thought of sleeping as in taking a rest. They were thinking, and many times your students, when you throw out a word, they think of it this way. But in order for this lesson to make sense, they need to think of it a different way. And so they think, well, actually, he died. And there is an aspect of death that is like sleep. And so, what we see here is then that a term, and you can fill this in here, like a term is a name for a concept. And a concept is a word or expression that has a precise, specialized meaning in certain contexts. And so, one of the things that makes learning boring for students is when we try to teach a concept as though it were a piece of information. You can't give somebody a concept. This is one of the most fascinating things I try to teach in my child development class, is the concept that you can't give somebody a concept. For you to get a concept, you've got to conceive it in your own mind. You have to think the thought after, and it has to click. If I give it to you as a piece of information, you can recite it back as a piece of information. And so, this in Bible class especially, or in Sunday school, all these terms like sanctification, propitiation, and forgiveness, all these terms, these are wonderful terms for things in the Christian life. But their names, they have a precise, specialized meaning. But much of our teaching involves, so let's go to something like this. So students have simple work, lift. But if we're studying aerodynamics, every lesson, almost every lesson involves terms. And they can be simple words like the word lift. But what does lift mean in this setting? Can you tell me what it words?
Refers to the partial vacuum above the wing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that force which keeps the plane in the air. And the weight, of course, would make it go down. And what happens if they're exactly the same? If the lift balances the weight, what happens? Does the plane fly through the air? If they balance each other. Does the plane, what happens to its altitude?
It stays fine.
Stays the same, right? They're balanced. Okay? And by the way, notice what I just did there. I'm not reading the question, so I gave a little leading question. What happens if the altitude stays the same? What happens if the lift increases and the weight stays the same? It goes higher. And right. And then what's meant by the drag, you suppose? See, drag has many definitions. You can drag race, class can be a drag, and also more. But here's a specialized meaning. Drag means what? In this context.
Wind resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wind resistance, anything that holds it back. And then thrust, of course. So, if your thrust increases and the drag stays the same, what happens to the speed of the plane? Goes faster. See, you're thinking. I framed a question, and your answer shows that you looked at them and you made a connection. But my point in this particular lesson is that here are 4 terms. And these are common everyday words that all the students know. But in aeronautics, they take on a specialized meaning in this context. And so let's look at, we don't have time to unpack a lot of these, I'll just put a bunch of them here. Let me just back up. So, as we teach, there are always terms, like a dike. Man-made structure. And you can ask a student, what is the dike? A man-made structure made by man to hold back water. And if you hear them parrot back the answer, they can probably pass the matching quiz, right? But suppose I ask you, oh, so is a dam a dike? They aren't. There's dams there, I guess. How's a dike? See, there are other man-made structures that hold back water besides dikes. And to understand the term, you have to engage with it a little bit. And if we have more time, we can talk about that more, but dikes are made to keep water from flowing out over flooding an area, whereas the dam is typically across the stream to hold back water in the stream bed. But notice, look at this one. What difficulty can you anticipate the student would have in understanding this term? Relate to Paul says antecedent.
Okay, what an antecedent is.
What is an antecedent? And is it first cousin or brother, or what does relate mean? What does relate mean? What's the call? And so sometimes reading a definition, you don't know any more than you knew before. You might be able to recite terms, but as you can see, teaching students, here's typical terms. I'll just give the list here because pointing out that every subject involves lots of terms. In fact, many textbooks at the beginning of the lesson will actually have a list of terms or whatever they call them. And oftentimes these words are bolded or underlined in the text. And oftentimes being able to understand the lesson involves being able to master these terms. If you really get the terms, which is the language. If you get the language, then you can get the lesson. If you don't get the terms, you don't get the lesson. And so you can see that there's a challenge in mastering the terms. Here's a list of terms taken from neighbors in Latin America, the 5th and 6th grade official handbook. Wow. Coup. What is a coup? Diplomacy. A rain shadow. What is a rain shadow? Is there somehow, how did you go about teaching what a rain shadow is? Any ideas?
Illustrated on the board.
And then make applications in everyday life. For example, why are the Great Plains brown? And for we live, it's nice and green. Okay, and so here's a summary of the laws after your paper. Know the meanings your pupils have of the words being used as terms. So, rain shadow. They know what rain is, they know what shadow is, they might think of shadow from the sun or something. So know the meanings they do have, and be able to tap into them, but also don't allow them to be confused by their previous understandings. And remember that terms are names for concepts. And if they don't get the concept, the name doesn't mean much. So that's one of your struggles in teaching all these terms. They can recite the definition for the term, but do they get it? Can they say it in their own words? Can they make an application? Ask them to express a lesson concept in their own words. All right, going to the truth to be taught. Must be taught through truth already known. So, one of the major ways of teaching is knowing your students, and when you want to teach something new, the more you know about your students' previous knowledge, the easier to teach them, because you can help them to make connections. For example, it might be a skill. Yesterday we learned this. I know that you know how to do this, and so today we're going to do this. Or students who have life experience. If you've been out and about, if you've never driven on a slippery road, you don't really know that if you want to make, much of teaching involves an analogy. This is like this. It's like putting your Tinker Toys together. Who knows what Tinker Toys are? Anybody? Okay, some of you are not sure. So I can't really use that as an analogy if you don't. But who knows what Legos are? Well, probably everybody. So if you know that your students are familiar with something, you can use it for a comparison. If they're not familiar with it, you can't use it as a comparison. So let's look at something. Is a spider an insect? So if they've already studied insects, if you know that they know that insects are those critters with 3 body parts and 6 legs and so forth, then when you look at the spider, you can say it's a spider an insect. Well, how do you know? Well, it doesn't have 2 legs. It doesn't have 3 body parts. So it can't be an insect based on that definition. So many times we learn by comparing and contrasting. Teachers through truth already know. And so to follow this law, you find a starting point that connects with the knowledge they already have. And so if you're in a skill subject, typically you pick up where you left off and you add something to it. Yesterday we looked at adjectives, they describe adverb pronouns. Today we're going to look at the words that describe verbs. These are adverbs. And the second one is, as it unfolds, point out connections as much as you can to other things in the student's life. So you find a starting point in their previous knowledge to teach the lesson, but as the lesson unfolds, that if possible, you point out connections to everyday life. And so, for example, division is the inverse of multiplication. If they already know that multiplying, if you take 4 sets of 5, you end up with 20. Well, if you take 20 and divide them into 4 sets, that's multiplication. Another example here could be something like this. Oftentimes there's so much overload of particular pieces of information. And if you can somehow organize these into one concept, really what we're looking at is fertilization. And all these things are working together to do one thing, to make a seed. And how does that happen? Well, there's 2 main parts here. There's this little skinny thing that produces pollen. Somehow this pollen has to get transferred from here over to here. And, you know, now we're into bees. And they know about bees, or they don't, you can tell them about it. It's fascinating. And so each of these things that we learn then have somehow fits together into a whole. And in conclusion, we can find out why people would have to pay money to somebody to bring in bees. Why would an orchard man pay you good money to bring your beehives in? Well, the trees need to be fertilized. And so there you're looking at details, but making some connections to everyday life. I'll just, we don't have time to unpack it, but I will just point out some applications here. So on your next page, I think there are some. So here's some illustrations. And so just quickly I'll point out how if you're going to teach a particular lesson, how do you go about thinking about this? Well, if you're going to teach, how do we add fractions with unlike denominators? Well, we're thinking of terms, and we're thinking of truth already known. So, you kind of assume that your students already know what addition means, what a fraction is, what proper and improper are, like and unlike. They're supposed to know what a numerator and denominator. These are all terms that you assume they know. If you're a skilled teacher and you look at this new lesson and you know your students, something might pop up and say, oh, I think that we better review what the denominators are different than denominator, numerator, or common denominators. Because if you say that you first have to get a common denominator, what's that? So you can kind of, well, yeah, we got that in place. And then you assume they already know that when you add fractions, you only add the numerators. And you assume they know that only fractions with common denominators can be added. That's all we've done so far. And you assume also that they know the same fraction can have many forms. Because if they don't know that, and you start changing the third into 12th, they don't know what's this all about. Why are we doing this? And so my point is here that you as a teacher consider the terms, or we've learned the terms, and what do we already know. And then you're ready to zero in on the one new truth here is that if you want to add unlike fractions, you're going to have to convert them into fractions with the same denominator, and then just add them, and you're good to go. Looking at squaring, how do you square a number? Well, the term square. Why do we call it square? And it's fascinating. People can square numbers for years and not think about that. When you square, you actually are building a square. If you have 2 units and 2 units, and you build a square, you end up with 4 square units. And so they already know how to multiply. I think I'll just move on to another one. That's sort of a concept. These are skills, a concept. So evaporation. We assume they already know certain terms. Boiling, condensation, solid, liquid, gas, freezing, thawing. We hope that those terms are already in place. And they also, here's where life experience plays in. you know that your students know about what puddle's drying up and what's drying on the wall or in the wash line. And they know about, probably know about water boiling away in a pan and maybe condensation. And if but they might not have thought about it, but you're going to realize that you'll make an application to that to teach this lesson. And then what you want them to understand is that when evaporation happens, all that happens is that the water goes from one state to another. It goes from a liquid state to a gaseous state, and guess what? It's still there. And so what would happen if we hung a whole lot, if we closed this room off, turned off the air system, and hung a lot of wet wash up in here, how would the air feel a couple hours from now? And why? Well, it would start feeling more muggy. Why? Because of evaporation. Looking at the concept of adjectives. So, it's a term for a word that describes a noun, pronoun, and so on. And they already know, students already speak, and they use adjectives in their everyday life. That's yucky. And they don't say, use an adjective there, but they know, and you know that they know it. And so you refer to those things in their everyday life. And in conclusion, the point is that actually adjectives enrich our language. They actually change the meaning of the word. So that a slimy apple is different from a crisp apple, from a red apple or a rotten apple. Going to something like separation of powers in the government. So we have terms like legislative, executive, judicial. If you're not sure about these, then you have to review the terms before you can teach the concept. And we have the lawmakers and the president, governor, and the judges. And then they also, in everyday life, they've probably seen a building in the middle of town that's called a courthouse. They've probably seen a capitol. And they're familiar with policemen and governors and judges, and you could ask them, suppose a policeman stopped you, or suppose a policeman arrested you for eating chocolate ice cream. You said, you're not allowed to eat chocolate ice cream. What would you think about that? So, we don't have any authority to do that. Well, why not? That's, it's unconstitutional. So, there are ways of getting at the rules of separation of power, and the conclusion is that each branch and every employee under the branch has a specific role, and it's limited. Policemen can carry out the law, but you can't make the law. Looking at stories, there's common terms that we assume they understand. Character, action, suspense. And let's take a story like The Hare and the Tortoise. So, the students already know from their everyday life, they know things about pride and boasting and daring and embarrassment. They know about these things. They've been embarrassed already. They know about daring. And so, in a story, what do you want to learn? Well, what does this look like in a story? Which animal was proud, and how do you know? How did he show it? And you can make other applications like, who would you rather have wash your dishes or clean your house, a hare or a tortoise? And if so, why? What does that behavior show? In the case of the Good Samaritan, you can understand, you can get a lot more value out of the story, out of the parable, if you understand these terms. If you know what a priest and if you know what a priest and a Levite is. These were class of people that that could be priests, whereas the Samaritans are none of these half priests. Pouring in oil and wine, you'll get more out of it. Dumping oil and wine like you dump wine on a person. Well, in those days, and we don't have time to, you would try to draw this out of your students, right? Try to draw it out for the discussion. But he gave first aid. It was a good way of a form of antiseptic, and then the truth to be understood. What does a neighbor look like in action? And in a case like this, it's fun to make another application. Years ago, somebody told this story. I heard about it and didn't hear it in person. Thanks to men in high school years ago. These were Mennonite young people, and he told this story. And first I think a Mennonite deacon came down the road. Somebody had trouble, and he went way past. And then the bishop came past. He went by. He blew by. And then who do you think stopped and helped the person? The Amish with his buddy. And these young people, they didn't like that because they didn't have much respect for older Amish. But point out, in this context, you might say something more like so, when the preacher comes past, and the teacher comes past, and the illegal immigrant comes by, and he stops, and he helps. Can I help you? The homeless person. And you'd have to pick the one that the people, ooh, I didn't think they would do that. But which one was acting neighborly? Well, the one that helped him. Why didn't they say the Samaritan? Why the one, I suppose, the one that helped him? Why do you think they? Why do you think they
were racist?
Pardon?
They were racist.
Yeah, they could not bring themselves to say the word Samaritan. Wow, the one that helped them. They had to say that. But so teaching, yes, the truth to be understood in terms of truth already known. And so I don't have time to unpack this, but Mansa Musa. Do you know about Mansa Musa? Does that mean something to you? Look at Mansa Musa was a fabulously wealthy king in Mali, which is Eastern Africa in the 1300s. Fabulously wealthy. And he made a pilgrimage, so there's a whole bunch of terms here, pilgrimage, artisans, and so on. And he made a pilgrimage to Mecca. And across northern Africa, he went through Egypt, he went to Mecca. And along the way, he had thousands of camels and slaves, and they were loaded down with gold. And everywhere he went, he spent so much gold and gave so much gold as gifts. People were lavish with gifts. When he got to Cairo, Egypt, he spent so much gold that he depressed the price of gold in the area for years afterwards. And when he met Pharaoh, this was a problem. He did meet the Pharaoh, and Mansa Musa didn't bow to anybody. And Pharaoh, nobody came to Pharaoh's presence without bowing. But these men wanted to meet. So somebody came up with a good idea of how they could meet without losing face. Are you smart enough to think of a way? What do you think they did? What do you think they did? They met together without either of them being offended. They were religious. Religious people do acts of worship. I'll give you some hints.
Probably both came and bowed to an idol or
Yes.
something like that.
Let us bow in acknowledgement of the gods. So they both bow at the same time. I didn't bow to you, you didn't bow to me, but I didn't come into your presence without bowing. And so in some cases in history, there are stories that are fascinating, and in order to get the story, there are certain terms involved, but the takeaway is his wealth was fable. Yeah, it was fabulous, really fabulous. And he actually, as a result of that trip, scholars collected their traders started going to Mali and got very, very wealthy. And then, of course, eventually the kingdom fell. If you're going to teach history or geography, take Chile, for example, there are certain terms involved, archipelago, desert, and how do you learn about this? What to teach in terms of truth already known? Students are familiar with their climate. You're familiar with how it is here. And so you can compare it to their landforms with our landforms, their winters with our winters, their weather with our weather. And what you want to take away is some information about Chile. And here's the conclusion. So we've been teaching the law, the language, and the lesson. And so some terms that I've been using are terms such as medium. The medium is that which we both engage. so we can communicate. We use things like shared language, term or concepts. I didn't talk much about these, but language involves more than words. It also involves body language. It involves symbols and connotations. And we also talked about knowledge and connections and meaning. And what's already known, there's common vocabulary, life experiences, and in conclusion, the whole point of this session was that language and life experiences are tools for new learning. When you teach, no matter what it is, the language that you use and tapping into your the life experiences in a skill subject are things you learned yesterday. Yesterday we learned how to find at least how to find multiples of 6. Today we're going to go on and look at something else. Any comments? I think it's time for a break here.